Welcome Internet to Psychoanalytic Talk. Today we're talking about the central ego and the ideal object. Theories developed by Ronald Fairbairn and part of the endo-psychic structure. So what is the central ego? Well, very simply, it is the equivalent of the conscious mind for Fairbairn. It's a part of us that's the more stable, that's the more capable of handling problematic issues without collapsing into the sub-egos, libidinal and anti-libidinal. It's basically, to put it very simply, it's the stable conscious mind that Fairbairn is talking about, the one in which people have their strong developed sense of identity. For example, they do recognize who they are, what they do, what they care about, and so on and so forth. This central ego is, at least in Fairbairn's view, it's present in everyone. And there's no person, at least in Fairbairn's model, of which of course there can always be refinements, but the main idea is that everyone has a central ego. It's just that it's more or less strong, more or less capable. And as you all know, the central ego is still an ego, and it still comes with the dyad. So for Fairbairn, every ego position comes with the corollary of being supported and backed by an object relation. That's the whole gist of Fairbairn. Everything is intertwined, relationships and who we are. And in the case of the central ego, the corollary is the ideal object. So the ideal object is very, very fundamentally an internalization of all the good elements of the relationship towards the caregiver. What does that mean? Well, it means that every time, for example, there's been happiness, every time there's been care, every time there's been love, every time that the caregiver has met the infant's needs or has been able to help the infant, all of that is going to be internalized as well, which that internalization is going to allow the ego, the stability of the ego, to be maintained, even though there might be moments of extreme stress or moments in which the ego is going to be submitted to intense pressures, both on the part of the unconscious mind, namely with the libidinal and anti-libidinal ego, but also in moments of life which are very complicated and very dangerous. For example, a good example of the central ego is given by Solani in his books and his articles, is one of plane engineer or plane technician that basically was absorbed into one of the plane's ventilators. He was able to survive, and mentally he was able to not be too scarred, because what he says is that he kept in mind the relationship he had had with a good mother, and that basically that love that he felt saved him, whereas other people might have basically collapsed into much more severe mental states. He was able to maintain his stability even through extremes because he had that sense of love that was inside of him, that was there to carry him. And to another extent, which I'm going to go to a much completely the opposite direction, but in, for example, experimental psychology, with experiments with, for example, lab rats or with guinea pigs, it is shown that animals who are given love, care, affection can survive prolonged exposure to, for example, to swimming. Whereas, for example, let's say you put one rat that you've loved, you've cared for, into a pool, and another one that you have never cared for. You put them both in the pool. The one has been loved, even though there's no way of escaping, is not going to give up hope. It's going to, on the contrary, push and push and push and swim and swim and swim until something happens, because it believes in the benevolence of the person that has loved them. Therefore, they will survive that hardship much longer than the rat that has had no love. Basically, the rat that has had love will last for multiple hours, whereas a rat that wasn't loved will only survive a couple of minutes. And why am I doing that? Because comparing humans to animals, normally I don't do it, but Fairbairn himself, in his articles, did point out that there was a corollary with animals also and object relations. So therefore, that's why I'm doing it. But I think the evidence is there also that people who have been loved tend to have high hopes and to have believed that something can happen, which is positive, which is good. And why do they feel that? It's because their central ego has been built and strengthened with the love, the care, the affection of the ideal object. Also, and I must make this very clear, the ideal object in Fairbairn's language does not mean perfect. It was a specific choice of word, I should say, but one has to always keep in mind it's not perfection that it's about. It's about taking care of the needs, being good enough, to use Winnicott's vocabulary, to be there for the child and be able to understand their needs. But I also do think, and this is my personal addition to this concept, that it's not just about tending to the needs. There also has to be limits that are drawn within the relationship between the central ego and the ideal object. Why so? So, very fundamentally, the central ego is built both on love, care, affection, but also on what can be done and what can't be done. However, those sense of limits cannot be arbitrary. It's not because father's upset or father's mad or because mother does not stand the child. It's because some things cannot be done, because they're collective rules that we must all abide by, and the child has to be able to integrate those rules. And contrary to a lot of what people now currently believe, that putting rules on children is already traumatizing them, quite the opposite. When they're integrated correctly within the frame of this is not acceptable for anyone, then they strengthen the central ego of the child. The child is then able to think, okay, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do. And when it's in a healthy system, it's not based on what the parents want or don't want, right? It's based on much deeper sense of a collective, of society itself. This is, for example, stealing is not acceptable, not because it shames mother and father. It's not that. It's because it's not morally right. It isn't the rules of the society. Therefore, the central ego is strengthened by understanding the rules, by developing the rules. Because what you have to understand is that those rules that are imposed on the child give them a framework and a reference of what is acceptable and what isn't. It also curtails fears of all powerfulness, because if the child does whatever it wants, then the corollary is, well, then everyone can do what they want. Therefore, anyone can do anything to me, which they can hurt me, they can harm me, they can insult me, and so on and so forth, because I can do it to them. Therefore, it's basically it basically transitions a system of kill, be killed, or destroy or be destroyed, to a system of there are limits, and no one destroys no one. We just are punished if we transgress, which is for the central ego so important, because central ego needs that stability, needs that baseline of rules in order for the development of security and a sense of security. Because also then the love becomes internalized, but it becomes internalized throughout rules. These will also allow further down the line the child to be able to postpone instant gratification. For example, to be able to refrain his drives in order to be able to focus on other tasks or something else. Solani points that out, I found incredibly well in one of his books, in which he explains the illusion of love, to name it, in which he explains that a child that has had good enough parent love and good enough lines of rules and behavior will be able, for example, to not go and suck the whole bottle of milk from the get-go. They will be able to postpone. They will be able to not buy that candy bar, to not throw a tantrum to buy the candy bar, because they know, they have a sense of security. They don't need a quick fix for the issue at hand, because they have a form of stability, because the central ego is strong enough for them to be able to integrate their drives without acting upon them, which is one of the main victories of civilization. It's our ability to not act out our urges directly, but to be able to transform them. And in Fairbairn's system, that transformation is made mainly due to the central ego and ideal object, because they provide the sense and the frame of a security in which a child can develop, grow, become someone new, and be able to re-experience the happy moments. Whereas the anti-libidinal ego and the libidinal ego both are moments of pure terror, in which the child is going to basically all try and merge with the object, because they feel that then everything will be perfect. It's an illusion, it's something that's not necessarily hopeful, but it's very destructive. And the anti-libidinal ego, in which the child will completely detach and will not want anything to do with relationships. Therefore, the central ego is a form of centralization of these two sub-egos, in which basically they are nullified by the central ego. The defenses, all the extreme, intense jeopardies that they can create when the central ego is stable and strong enough, allows them to be able to curtail themselves, to withdraw, because the central ego is not going to break. But if the central ego is weakened by trauma, by abuse, and so on and so forth, then it becomes fragile, and those true sub-egos can come back much quicker than they should. And the patient feels that they are overwhelmed by. And that's the whole point of psychotherapy, at least how I consider it, is to become, as a therapist, the ideal object. Again, not perfect. Ideal, good enough, in order for the patient to be then able to internalize all that positivity and grow the central ego, be able to, in a way, withstand the pressures of life, thanks to the benevolency of the therapist that has been integrated. Therefore, then that link will help them deal with their sub-egos without being destroyed. And that sense of security of not being destroyed needs to be established by the dialectic between the central ego and the ideal object. That will then basically give an immense solidity to the mind of the individual. That's pretty much it for this video. If you have any questions, of course, as usual, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.